During that Christmas dinner, amid the soft background music and the smell of roasted turkey, my mother lifted her glass of red wine and said in front of everyone, "I wish you were never born." It didn't sound like an outburst of anger, it was more like a verdict that had been waiting for years to be delivered. Family ashes welcomes you. Have you ever heard a family member say something that made you wish you could disappear? When affection is replaced by condition and reputation, every meal becomes a stage, and you're just the weary supporting role trying to perform your part. If you've ever lived in such a family, stay until the end, because this might be your story. And if you know that feeling, please leave a comment below so I'll know I'm not alone. My name is Harper Lee, 31 years old, investigative journalist for the Denver Sentinel. I live in Colorado, in a small apartment overlooking the Rockies, where winters are long and quiet enough that I can hear my own heartbeat while typing. I grew up in Aspen, a town famous for its snow and for people who need to prove their lives are flawless. My mother, Linda Lee, is a sought-after interior designer, a woman who lives to be admired. My father, Douglas, a former military officer, now works as a security consultant for major corporations, a quiet man who always chooses silence over confrontation. In our house, image mattered more than truth. My mother used to say, "The Lees never make mistakes," as if honor were something you could polish with silk. My younger sister, Chloe, was the perfect example, a young attorney in Boston, confident voice, upright posture, a smile that always appeared at the right time. In my mother's eyes, Chloe was the golden child, while I was just the crack she tried to cover with another coat of paint. My childhood felt like living inside a glass house, everything gleaming, perfect, and suffocating. My mother, Linda Lee, never allowed anything to stray from the picture she painted of a proper American family. My clothes were chosen for me, from fabric color to skirt length, my hair had to be brushed into a classic style, and my shoes polished until they could reflect her face. Every morning before I left the house, she inspected me like a stylist checking a model before a runway show. "Is your blouse pressed? Your collar straight?" A Lee girl never looks sloppy. I used to wish, just once, that I could wear an old hoodie and ripped jeans like my classmates without her staring at me as if I had committed a crime. It wasn't just the clothes, my entire life was governed by an unspoken rule called class. Grades had to be perfect, friends had to come from respectable families, and hobbies had to fit the family image. I was never free to choose my own electives, never allowed to go on spontaneous school trips. Mother always said, "You don't have time for meaningless things like that. You're building your future." Her future, not mine. I knew I was different early on. I loved writing, the way words could say what I couldn't. I wrote everything down in notebooks, my parents' quiet arguments, the scent of candles in the living room, the echo of my mother's heels across the wooden floor when she was angry. When I told her I wanted to become a journalist, she laughed. "A journalist? That's a profession for people who dig through others' dirty laundry. You weren't born for something that cheap." I stood there, swallowing the lump in my throat, my heart pounding with humiliation. But instead of putting out the fire inside me, her words only made it burn quieter and stronger. When I was 15, I wrote my first investigative article for the school newspaper. It exposed how the administration had misused funds for the Winter Festival, a small issue, but one that touched the wrong people's pockets. The piece was published, causing a stir around the school, and within 2 days, everyone in Aspen knew my name. I thought my mother would be proud. But when she came home that evening, I knew I was wrong. Her face was pale, her hand clenched around the wrinkled newspaper, her voice shaking with rage. "Do you know how many snide comments I had to endure at the parent club today? They asked why my daughter had to air our dirty laundry. Do you know how humiliated I was, Harper?" I tried to explain that the article wasn't targeting anyone, that it was just the truth, but she wouldn't listen. She looked at me as if I had stained the family's honor beyond repair. From that day on, my mother never introduced me as my eldest daughter, Harper, anymore. Whenever someone asked, she would smile, a polite, practiced smile, and reply, "She's the stubborn one in the family." A harmless sentence on the surface, but to me, it was a small knife that cut a little deeper every time it was repeated. My father, as usual, said nothing. He only sighed, patted my shoulder, and said softly, "Don't upset your mother anymore. It sounded like comfort, but to me, it was a sentence passed down, a reminder that in our house, my mother's feelings were the center of the universe, and I was just a tiny satellite orbiting around her, forbidden to shine too brightly. I learned to stay silent, but inside my head, I started writing, pieces that were never sent anywhere, conversations I never dared to speak out loud. Every night, lying in bed under the faint glow of the nightlight, I imagined living somewhere else, a city where no one cared what I wore, who I knew, or whether I looked presentable. I didn't know it then, but those quiet nights were planting the seed for the decision that would later change everything, that fateful Christmas night when my mother would say, "I wish you were never born." I left Aspen on a cloudy September morning, carrying an old suitcase, $200 in savings, and an acceptance letter from the School of Journalism at the University of Washington. My mother drove me to the airport, not to wish me luck, but to make a point. Standing in the terminal in her beige coat, drenched in Dior perfume, she spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "You're wasting your potential, Harper. Journalism isn't a career for a lead girl." When I told her I had turned down the law school offer, her face darkened, as if I'd confessed to a crime. "I'm not paying a cent for that ridiculous writing career," she said, then turned on her heels, the sound of her high heels echoing on the marble floor. I stood there, watching her walk away, my heart pounding, half in fear, half in something else that felt dangerously like freedom. Seattle greeted me with rain and the smell of burnt coffee. I rented a small room in an old three-story house in the U District, where the paint was peeling, the hallway narrow, but the landlady kind and no one cared who I was. On my first day of class, I sat in a large lecture hall listening to the professor talk about truth in journalism, and I felt my throat tighten. I knew instantly, I belonged there. I got a job at a tiny coffee shop on Roosevelt Avenue. Every morning, I opened the shop at 6, made dozens of cappuccinos, wiped tables, took out the trash, and then ran to class. My evening shifts ended around 10, after which I'd stay in the library until midnight, writing articles and fixing commas. Some nights, my hands cracked from washing dishes in hot water, but I'd catch myself smiling. Even in exhaustion, I knew I was living on my own terms, no longer a puppet in my mother's perfect little play. Every month, I sent her a short message, "I'm fine." She replied with phone calls that sounded more like reports than conversations. "You sound tired. Don't you take care of yourself, or your sister just started her internship at a prestigious law firm in Boston? How long do you plan on writing those little articles?" I learned to let the phone ring 5 times before answering. I learned to speak less, to avoid confrontation. After every call, I would sit quietly, watching the rain slide down the window, listening to the sound of buses gliding through the wet streets, and whisper to myself, "Just a little longer. Once you graduate, you'll be free of her forever." In my 3rd year, I received my first paycheck, $65 for an article about a homeless veteran living by the waterfront. When the check arrived at my dorm, with my name printed in neat blue ink, I held it in my trembling hands. $65 wasn't much, but it was proof that I could stand on my own 2 feet without her money. I tucked the check carefully into my notebook, as if it were a relic of freedom. For years later, I graduated with honors and a pair of hands calloused from too much work. On graduation day, I emailed a photo to my father. My mother never replied. I wasn't surprised. In Aspen, she was probably hosting a party to celebrate Chloe's new job offer at a top law firm. But freedom, I would soon learn, comes at a price. I left school with over $40,000 in student debt. The newspapers in Seattle weren't hiring, and my rent kept rising. I tried to hold on, but reality always wins in the end. When the Denver Sentinel announced an opening for a junior reporter, I applied out of desperation. A week later, they called me for an interview. 3 weeks after that, I got the job. I returned to Colorado on a summer afternoon, carrying a few boxes of books, an old camera, and a promise to myself, "It's just temporary, Harper. Just temporary." My mother greeted me at the door, gave me a half-hearted hug, and said, "You've lost weight. I suppose no one in Seattle ever taught you how to eat properly." I smiled and said nothing. Deep down, I wanted to believe that this time might be different, that if I tried a little harder, she would see I wasn't the stubborn daughter I used to be. But when I stepped inside the house and saw the framed family photos on the wall, all featuring Chloe, not a single one with me, I knew I had just walked back into the same gilded cage. It still gleamed, still smelled of polish and wealth, but the door had never truly been open. I met Ethan Cole during an interview for a field reporter position at the Denver Sentinel in mid-March, when the wind from the Rockies still bit through every layer of clothing. He sat in the back row, leaning against his chair, camera in hand, eyes steady and observant, the kind of gaze that seemed to read the story behind every face it met. When I asked about his work, he said simply, "I used to shoot in Ukraine. Now I just want to photograph the living, not the dead." He didn't raise his voice or try to sound profound, but the honesty in his tone made me fall silent for a long moment. There was something in that voice, weary but sincere, that made me want to hear more. Ethan was not the kind of man my mother could ever tolerate. He wore thick cotton shirts with the sleeves rolled up, revealing a faded tattoo down his arm, the name of a fallen comrade. He didn't talk much, but when he did, every word seemed to matter. In the first weeks working together, I found myself startled by his patience. I was used to people interrupting, judging, directing. He only listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking questions that made me rethink what I thought I knew. We began taking assignments together, driving long hours through the dull stretches of the suburbs. Once, during a trip, my phone rang, my mother, of course. Her voice filled the car, sharp even through the speaker. "You're seeing people without ambition again, aren't you? Don't come crying to me when you get dragged down with them." I hung up, staring out the window. Ethan glanced at me, then asked quietly, "She still tries to control everything?" I laughed dryly. "No. She just wants me to live the way she would." He didn't reply, just handed me a cup of coffee, still warm. Somehow, that small gesture eased the tightness in my chest better than any comforting words ever could. We fell in love not long after, a love that came quietly, naturally, like breathing. I didn't love Ethan because he had been a war photographer or because he carried the weight of his past. I loved him because he never tried to fix me. He never told me to be softer, never compared me to anyone, never used the word proper. For the first time, I felt like I didn't have to perform the role of the perfect daughter or stay silent to be loved. When I told my mother I wanted to bring Ethan home for dinner, she was silent for a long time, then gave a faint, icy laugh. "A man with tattoos and no fancy degree? Harper, how many more times are you going to embarrass me?" I didn't respond. The dinner went exactly as I had expected. The lighting was warm, but the air was colder than the winter outside. My mother looked at Ethan as though he were a stain on an expensive dress. Chloe smiled awkwardly, trying to diffuse the tension, while my father avoided my gaze, pretending to focus on his plate. Each time Ethan spoke, my mother cut in with a small, polite remark that stung just enough. "Oh, you're a photographer? Weddings or commercials?" Ethan only smiled and said calmly, "I photograph real life. It doesn't need artificial light." I sat there, caught between two worlds. On one side, the mother who had spent her life trying to mold me into her image, on the other, the man whose quiet eyes told me that I was already enough. And in that moment, when his hand found mine under the table and squeezed gently, I realized, this might be the first time in my life I no longer wanted my mother's approval. I just wanted to be myself, an ordinary woman, loved without needing permission. That December, snow fell heavier than usual, and Denver glowed under the holiday lights. I had just finished a 6-month investigative series on domestic violence in rural areas, stories that changed me more than I could ever have imagined. The day the newsroom announced my nomination for a National Journalism Award, the entire office clapped. My colleagues hugged me, and Ethan showed up with a small bouquet and a cup of hot cocoa, grinning as he said, "I told you so. I knew you'd make the whole country read your words one day." I laughed, feeling my heart as light as a child's, like I had finally touched the dream I'd been chasing all along. That night, I called my mother, not to boast, but to share. I still wanted her to know, just once, that I had done something meaningful. But when I finished speaking, all I heard was a dry laugh on the other end. "So you're still digging up people's dirty laundry, huh? Sensational journalism isn't a real job, Harper. No one pays people to profit off the misery of others." I sat there, listening to her voice through the phone, cold, measured, sharp as needles in my ear. I thought about explaining, telling her that I wrote to give a voice to the unheard, that my work had reopened 3 neglected police cases, but I stopped. I knew she didn't care. In my mother's world, only appearances mattered, and in her eyes, I would always be the stain on hers. After that night, I decided that Ethan and I would leave Denver after the new year. We had planned to start a small media company in Seattle, a city that had once felt like home to both of us. Ethan would handle photography, I would focus on investigative and human interest reporting. We'd already found a small loft near Lake Union, good light, reasonable rent. Everything seemed to be falling into place, until my mother found out. I hadn't told her, but I forgot that in our family, news always traveled faster than I could. Maybe Chloe told her, or maybe one of her old social club friends saw my post on LinkedIn. That evening, as I sat revising a draft, my phone rang. Her voice floated through, sweet, deliberate, with that faint edge of expensive cigarette smoke. If you're planning to run off with him, remember this, you're no longer my daughter. I stayed silent. I could hear the faint clink of a wine glass on her wooden table, the wind howling through the aspen windows. A part of me wanted to fight back, to say I wasn't running away, that I was just living my own life. But the other part knew it was useless. So I said simply, I just want to be happy, Mom. Then I hung up. Ethan sat across from me, his eyes quietly following my movements. He didn't ask. He just nodded. I'll still go back to Aspen for Christmas, I said softly. His brow furrowed. Are you sure? I nodded again. I need to say goodbye. Not to them, to the version of myself that still lives there. I knew that trip wouldn't be easy. But deep down, I felt it would be the last time I'd ever have to face those walls, the same walls that had raised me, caged me, and taught me to shrink. Once I left again, I would never have to look back. That night, the house in Aspen glowed like a stage, and it truly was one, every detail choreographed by my mother, from the lighting to her smile. $40,000 worth of crystal sparkled overhead, reflecting off the white lace tablecloth and the vanilla-scented candles. I used to love that house, but that night, every beam of light made it harder to breathe, as if even the furniture was watching me with the same disdain my mother carried in her eyes. She appeared from the kitchen in a wine-red gown, Cartier bracelets glittering on her wrists. She greeted guests with that bright, charming smile and a voice soft enough to deceive anyone who didn't know her. People praised her, the perfect hostess, the woman of the season, while I stood nearby, watching a performer who had rehearsed every line. When the guests finally left, the golden light caught her face, and the smile vanished. Her eyes slid over me, cold as steel. Don't ruin tonight, understood? She said quietly, but her voice had weight, enough to make me freeze. I nodded, feeling 15 again. My father sat at the head of the table, quietly cutting the roast chicken. Chloe and her husband, a young, polished lawyer who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine, sat beside my mother. Everything was so perfectly arranged that there seemed to be no place for me at all. When the food was served, I heard the clinking of glasses, Chloe's bright laughter, and for a moment, it felt like I was a guest in someone else's house. My mother raised her wine glass, her voice clear and proud. First, let's all congratulate Chloe, the golden girl of the Lee family, for her invitation to join a prestigious law firm in Boston. Polite applause followed, the sound of cutlery tapping plates, the air thick with practiced cheer. Chloe blushed, avoiding my gaze. I smiled too, lifted my glass, but my heart pounded like a drum. I knew what was coming, it always came. She set her glass down, her eyes shifting toward me. The smile stayed on her lips, but her tone had changed. And what about you, Harper? When will you stop playing reporter and get a real job? Her words were sugar-coated, but the insult beneath them was sharp. The table fell silent. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, waiting, wondering if I would bow my head this time. I took a deep breath, kept my voice steady. I was just nominated for a National Journalism Award, Mom. The corner of her mouth twitched, then she laughed, short, sharp, brittle, like the sound of glass cracking. No award will ever save the Lee family name, she said, her eyes glinting with disdain. Especially not when you're running off with an unemployed man. The air froze solid. I heard Chloe's fork drop onto her porcelain plate, the knife in my father's hand suspended midair, and for a moment, the silence in the room was so deep it rang in my ears. I looked straight at my mother. She sat upright, her spine perfectly straight, the crystal chandelier casting a cold, regal glow across her face, the light of someone long accustomed to power. My hands tightened around the napkin until the fabric wrinkled, but I kept my voice steady. I think, I said quietly, my job is to tell the truth, not to live to please others. She didn't reply. Her eyebrow lifted slightly before she turned away, as if my words were nothing but background noise in her carefully staged evening. I stayed seated a few more minutes, watching the candles flicker, listening to the faint clink of wine glasses, feeling my chest grow hollow. I knew then that the storm had begun, and it wouldn't stop until everything in that house came crashing down. The air grew heavy, thick, as if someone had sealed every window shut. I could hear the soft tap of a spoon against a glass, the faint slosh of wine, and my father's long, tired sigh. My mother sat at the head of the table, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes locked on Ethan as though she were staring at a crack in her perfect mirror. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Ethan looked up, the warm light glancing across his face, his eyes calm, steady, unflinching. "I'm sorry if I've offended you," he said, voice low but firm. "But I run my own independent studio. We have annual contracts worth over $120,000. His tone wasn't loud or boastful, just even, respectful, an attempt to salvage what little civility was left at the table. But to my mother, those words were a chisel against the marble of her pride, and I could see the first crack appear. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pulled tight, and she hissed through her teeth, "A real man doesn't brag about such a small sum." The words came out soft, but sharp as steel. Chloe swallowed hard and stared down at her plate, while my father set his glass down gently, careful not to make a sound. I knew that look from my mother, the same one she'd used on me since I was 10, the look that silenced me more effectively than shouting ever could. It was the look of someone who believed everything, even her children's silence, belonged to her. Ethan didn't flinch. He gave a faint smile, not bitter, not defensive, simply polite. That composure, more than anything, seemed to enrage her further. I saw the veins rise on her wrist as she twisted her glass. The scent of fermented grapes mingled with the faint trace of the cigarettes she thought no one knew she smoked in the kitchen, and the mixture made my throat burn. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. I started talking about our plans to move to Seattle after the new year, how Ethan and I had found a small apartment, how we wanted to start a media company together. My tone was calm, deliberate, not asking for permission, only hoping, for once, to be heard. But before I could finish, my mother slammed her glass down. The crystal struck the wooden table with a sharp crack that made me jump. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a low, cold register, like wind slipping through a narrow gap in the door. "If you go, you're dead to me." The room fell deathly silent. No one dared move. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud. My mother's eyes glimmered with something I had never seen before, not anger, but ownership, pure and ruthless. I stared at her for a long moment. Memories flooded in, mornings when she scolded me for a wrinkled dress, times I tried to explain myself only to be cut off, nights I lay awake wondering how perfect I'd have to be to earn love. And in that instant, I understood, I had been dead to her for years. I just hadn't yet buried the part of me that still longed for her approval. I placed my napkin on the table, slowly, deliberately, almost ceremoniously. My voice came out calm, clear. "I think I've been dead to you for a long time, Mother." The words didn't sound like defiance, they sounded like a eulogy. She froze for half a second, then turned away, pretending to refill her wine. Her hands trembled slightly, but she hid it, just as she'd always hidden every crack beneath a coat of pride. My father said nothing. He lowered his eyes, bit his lip, as if even he knew there was nothing left to save. Chloe turned away, tears glimmering in her eyes, and Ethan remained standing, looking at me with an expression I'll never forget, the look of someone watching another person burn through the rope that once bound them, knowing full well it will hurt, but that it must be done. When we stood up, the scraping of our chairs against the floor shrieked through the stillness, slicing the air like a blade. Ethan bowed slightly, his tone still courteous, "Thank you for dinner." My mother didn't answer. I smiled faintly and said, "Merry Christmas." Then we turned and walked away. The door opened, and the night wind swept in, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of snow. Behind me came the clatter of dishes, the sound of a wine glass tipping over, and my mother's voice, sharp, indistinct, fading into the storm. As we stepped down the icy porch steps, I squeezed Ethan's hand. For the first time in my life, amid the freezing air, I felt something warm, not the warmth of family, but of freedom finally reclaimed. That Christmas night ended with the wind howling through the pine trees heavy with snow. I sat in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The light from the house glowed faintly in the rearview mirror, bright but cold, like her eyes. Every time I remembered her words, "If you go, you're dead to me," my heart clenched, as if someone had drawn a sharp line straight through it. I drove into the falling snow, not knowing where I was going, only certain I couldn't turn back. The next morning, I woke up in my small Denver apartment, head pounding, throat dry. Ethan was still asleep, his breathing slow and even. I got out of bed, looked around the quiet room filled with pale light seeping through the curtains, and opened my laptop. The screen's glow reflected my tired face in the dark glass. I knew what I had to do, something I had never dared before: cut every remaining tie. First, I blocked every phone number from my family. Mom was at the top of the list, then Dad, then Chloe. I hesitated for a moment before pressing the button. My heart raced, as if afraid someone might catch me in the act. After the first click, the screen displayed a simple message: "Contact blocked." Just 3 words, yet they carried more weight than any declaration I'd ever made. I went through the rest one by one until only friends, colleagues, and Ethan remained. Next, I logged into my bank account. Ever since I started working, my mother had insisted on having access to help you manage your finances. In truth, it was just another way for her to keep control, every withdrawal, every expense, she knew. I opened a new account, transferred all my money there, and revoked her access. When the screen finally read "Transaction successful," I sat still for a long time, hands trembling, feeling as if I'd just removed an invisible collar that had been strangling me for years. At noon, I called the health insurance company and requested to remove myself from the family plan. The representative asked why. I answered simply, "I want to take care of myself." My voice sounded rough but firm. When the call ended, I set the phone down and stared at the wall. My chest felt hollow. A part of me wanted to cry, but no tears came. That afternoon, an email notification popped up. The sender, Dad. The subject line, "Don't do this." I opened it. "I hope you won't hurt your mother any further. She's very upset. I don't want to see this family fall apart." I read it again and again, feeling my chest tighten. His words weren't scolding, just weary. But somehow, they hurt worse than anger would have. I started typing a reply, then deleted every word. There was nothing left to say. The damage had been done long ago. I had simply stopped pretending not to see it. The days that followed passed in a blur. I went to work, smiled at colleagues, but at night, sleep refused to come. Some nights, I dreamed of my mother, standing in the kitchen under the harsh light, her face pale and cold. Her voice was calm, distinct, almost gentle: "You'll never be enough." I would jolt awake, heart pounding, shirt soaked with sweat. The faint glow from the streetlight spilled through the curtains, tracing pale lines across the room. I would sit upright, head in my hands, forcing myself to breathe, whispering that she wasn't here anymore, that I was finally free. But even in the silence, her voice lingered, slipping through the cracks of the night. Ethan was always there, steady and quiet. He never asked questions, never lectured, never told me to be strong. He simply stayed, making me tea in the morning, waiting until I took a few bites even when I had no appetite, sitting beside me in silence so I wouldn't feel alone. On nights when I broke down, crying not from pain but from exhaustion, he'd only hold my hand, gently, firmly, as if words might shatter what little peace I had left. I began to realize that what hurt me most wasn't her saying, "You're dead to me," but the truth that for my entire life, I had been exhausting myself just to be loved. I had spent years trying to be worthy in the eyes of someone who had never truly seen me. And now, with every tie finally cut, I understood that freedom was just another form of loneliness. But it was the kind of loneliness I chose, and for that reason alone, it was worth it. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman reflected there. Dark circles under my eyes, hair tangled, face pale and tired. But there was something new in that reflection, a hint of calm, a trace of courage. I didn't know where I was going next, or how long it would take for the past to stop pulling me back. But at least I knew one thing for certain, I would never return. Outside, snow was falling again, slow and quiet, each flake landing softly against the window. I exhaled, and for the first time in years, that breath felt like mine, not shaped by anyone else, not measured or monitored. Just me, Ethan, and a wide, cold, honest sky. I began therapy on a March afternoon, when Denver still carried the breath of winter. The sky hung gray, thin as smoke, and I drove to my first appointment in complete silence. The radio still played Christmas songs, an unfunny joke from the universe. I turned it off and sat there in the car for a long time before stepping out. A part of me still thought I didn't need therapy, that I was strong enough to heal on my own. But then I remembered that Christmas night, my mother's eyes, her voice, the sharp crash of crystal, and I understood that if I didn't find a way to silence those sounds, they would haunt me for the rest of my life. Dr. Amanda Brooks's office was on the 4th floor of an old building downtown, at the end of a hallway bathed in warm yellow light. When I entered, she was stacking books. No white coat, no smell of disinfectant, no sterile chill. The room smelled of chamomile tea, old paper, and pine wood. A brown armchair, shelves lined with books, paintings of nameless faces, indistinct, but full of emotion. She gestured for me to sit, didn't ask questions right away, just said, "Start by breathing." I breathed. And in that instant, tears fell before I could stop them. During that first session, my words came in fragments, as if each one snagged on a knot in my throat. I told her about my mother, the house in Aspen, the invisible rules I was born into, and that Christmas night, when she set her glass down and said I was dead to her. Dr. Brooks listened without pity, only understanding. When I fell silent, she said softly, "People who grow up in controlling families often confuse love with endurance. They think to be loved, they must tolerate, stay quiet, shrink themselves to fit others' expectations. But in truth, boundaries are the highest form of love." I remember sitting still for a long time after that. Her words landed like a needle touching a nerve that had been numb for years. Boundaries. Such a simple word, yet one I had never learned to set for myself. In my family, love meant obedience, sacrifice, keeping the peace no matter the cost, even if it meant breaking yourself to keep others comfortable. I had never known that love without boundaries was simply possession dressed as devotion. In the sessions that followed, I learned to name the emotions I had long avoided: anger, guilt, shame, hurt. Some days I spoke for an hour until my voice cracked, other days I sat in silence, watching the city move through the window, unable to say a word. She never rushed me. When I stayed quiet, she said, "Silence is another way of telling the story." Slowly, I realized that what I needed wasn't to forget, it was to remember properly. To let myself feel the pain, to stop pretending it didn't exist, to let it breathe until it softened. One afternoon, I told her I was afraid that if my mother ever called again, I'd answer. She asked, "If she does call, what could you do to protect yourself?" I thought for a long time before answering, "I'll write." Dr. Brooks nodded. "Good. Write to hold on to what you've learned. Write so you don't forget how far you've come." That night, I went home, opened my laptop, and began. At first, it was only a few broken lines, scattered fragments of memory, like rusty nails pulled from old wood, the smell of her perfume, the sharp laugh when I spoke about my dreams, the suffocating stillness of dinners where everyone talked over me. But the more I wrote, the more the pieces started to fit together, forming shape, forming meaning. I wasn't writing to accuse anyone, I was writing to tell my story. The story of someone who had once been buried beneath expectation, and who was learning, finally, to breathe again. I titled the document What I Survived. I wrote for weeks. Some nights, I stayed up until dawn, my hands trembling from the cold, yet my mind clearer than it had ever been. Every word I typed felt like pulling a heavy shard out of myself. I wrote about my father's silence, about my sister's eyes when she wanted to speak but couldn't, and about myself, the daughter who once believed that if she just behaved a little better, her mother would finally love her. Ethan saw it all and said nothing. He didn't ask what I was writing, never tried to read over my shoulder. He would simply place a cup of warm tea beside me and leave quietly, letting me be alone with my words. On nights when exhaustion pulled me down onto the desk, he'd gently drape a blanket over my shoulders, adjust the chair, and turn off the light. Once, I woke in the middle of the night and saw him sitting by the wall, eyes closed, the printed pages of my manuscript open across his knees. The next morning, as sunlight slipped through the blinds, he had finished the first few chapters. When I stepped into the kitchen, he was sitting there, the papers still in his hands, his eyes tracing each line. I froze, my heart pounding. When he finally looked up, he didn't say a word, he just placed his hand on my shoulder. His eyes were deep, gentle, and sad. That simple touch broke me. I cried, not from pity, but because for the first time in my life, someone had truly listened, without trying to correct me, without telling me not to overthink, without defending anyone. He just listened, fully, quietly, as if my story mattered. That night, I sat alone, staring at the stack of printed pages on my desk, and realized I was no longer the frightened daughter from the house in Aspen. I had begun to tell my story, not to seek sympathy, but to reclaim the voice that had been silenced for so long. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first time I had ever truly healed. 6 months after that fateful Christmas night, Ethan and I left Denver to start an entirely new chapter. The bus wound through the snow-capped mountains, the rain had just cleared, and the pale morning light streamed through the windows as if washing everything clean. I rested my head against the glass, watching the endless road unfold ahead, and realized I wasn't running anymore. I was really leaving. Seattle welcomed us with the smell of roasted coffee drifting through the streets and the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest. The loft we rented in Fremont was just over 1,200 square feet, with high ceilings and old red brick walls still bearing traces of their age. From the balcony, we could see the glimmer of Lake Union under the sunlight. Each morning, when I opened the window, the cries of seagulls echoed from afar, and the breeze carried a faint briny scent through my hair. It wasn't a luxurious space, but every corner breathed freedom. Ethan quickly turned the lower floor into a small photo studio. He hung on the walls the photos he had taken during his travels, the smile of a child, the silhouette of a mother shielding her child from the rain, the quiet landscapes of small villages he had once passed through. He said, "Real beauty doesn't live in what's perfect, but in what's still alive." His studio slowly gained steady clients, then grew faster than either of us expected. He began receiving contracts, then hosting small exhibitions, where people came not only to see his photographs but to hear the stories behind them. As for me, after months of freelancing for small outlets, I received an offer to become a senior editor at a social affairs journal in Seattle. I accepted. It was a place where I could write about people, ordinary, resilient people. During those first days in the new office, I felt as if I'd come back to life. No judgmental glances, no pressure to prove my worth. I worked hard, writing about the topics most avoided: silence within families, children forced to live under the weight of their parents' expectations, women who walked away from the places they once called home to find themselves again. One late night, while the city lay under a blanket of fog, I sat at my desk and began writing an article titled "The Children Buried Alive by Expectations." It started as a small story, but as I wrote, it grew, becoming the voice of an entire generation. I wasn't writing to condemn anyone, but to let those like me know they weren't alone. I wrote straight through the night, my fingers aching, eyes stinging, but I didn't stop. The piece was published 3 days later. I didn't expect anything, but by that first morning, the newsroom inbox was overflowing. Some wrote that they cried while reading it. Others said they had spent their whole youth chasing approval that never came. One woman said the story gave her the courage to leave a relationship that was suffocating her. Each letter, each word of gratitude made my throat tighten. I realized then that telling my story wasn't just a way to heal myself, it was a way to light a path for others still trapped in their own dark rooms, searching for the door. That night, I sat by the window overlooking Lake Union, where the rippling water reflected the city's golden lights. Ethan handed me a printed copy of my article with a handwritten note: "You've turned your pain into light." I couldn't speak. I only nodded, because I knew he understood that I had lost so much to arrive at this moment. I no longer felt the need to prove anything to my mother. I no longer trembled at the memory of that house in Aspen, or at the sound of wine glasses clinking against crystal on that fateful night. Now, I lived in a strange city, surrounded by the scent of rain and sea air, but every morning when I woke, I knew I was living my life, imperfect, but real. When night fell, I opened the window. The cold wind swept in, carrying the scent of the water. I whispered to myself, I've finally escaped the fear. And as the reflection of the city lights glimmered across the glass, I saw myself, not the girl who once curled into silence, but a woman standing steady in a vast world, free and at peace. The next morning, mist covered the whole city of Seattle. Dew clung to the window frame of our small loft. When I stepped outside to fetch the newspaper, a cream-colored envelope lay neatly on the doormat, placed as though the sender wanted to ensure I'd see it first thing. On the corner, written in firm, precise black ink, to Harper Lee. The handwriting, straight, deliberate, each curve measured, I knew instantly, it was my mother's. Linda M. Lee. I stood there for a long moment, not touching it. Strange, how a single thin envelope could make my heart pound as if it were something that might explode. The feeling was familiar, the same as when I was little, standing outside her office door, hearing the rhythmic tapping on her desk, knowing I was about to be summoned to have a serious talk. Ethan was in the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the room. He looked up and saw me still standing by the door. "A letter?" he asked softly. I nodded, my throat dry. "From my mother." He didn't say anything. He just watched me for a moment, then turned back to the kettle. I knew he wanted me to decide for myself. I brought the envelope inside and set it on the table. The paper was thick, the seal perfectly pressed, and faintly stamped with wax, her old habit, every detail executed with precision. I took the scissors and cut the edge. Instantly, a familiar scent escaped, her perfume, that blend of jasmine and sandalwood, light but enough to tighten my chest. I sat down, took a deep breath, and pulled out the letter. 4 pages. Each line even, every word spelled perfectly. I began to read. The first page was filled with guilt and justification. She couldn't sleep since Christmas, the house felt empty without me, my father had grown quiet, and I had taken away the most important part of her life. She wrote, "No matter what, I am still your mother. Nothing can change that. I just want things to go back to the way they were." By the middle of the second page, the tone had shifted completely. The writing grew darker, the lines shorter, faster, like the sound of heels striking a wooden floor. "If you plan to keep living this irresponsible, so-called free life, don't expect a cent from me. Don't forget, the Aspen house, your father's accounts, everything is still under the Lee family name. I didn't work this hard just for you to throw our reputation away over some cheap articles." Then, the final line, the ink pressed so hard it bled through the paper, "If you don't come back, don't expect to be recognized as my daughter." I set the letter down and stared at it. My hands trembled, not from fear, but because my body still didn't know how to stay calm in the face of that voice, the voice of someone who had always believed she had the right to define everything, love, honor, even my worth. Outside the window, the rain continued, each drop tapping against the glass like the rhythm of old memories. I thought I should feel angry, or maybe cry. But instead, a strange stillness settled over me, quiet, clean, like the breath that follows a long run. Maybe because I had been waiting for this letter for 6 months, not to read it, but to confirm what I already knew, she hadn't changed. And I had been right to leave. Ethan came over with 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of me, glanced at the letter, and asked softly, "What will you do?" I smiled faintly. My voice was calm. "Put it away." I stood up and walked to the bookshelf in the corner of the room. On the second shelf sat a small wooden box I'd labeled the day I moved to Seattle, family, archive, no response. Inside were a few things I had kept, some old photographs, one of my mother's hospital bills from when I was little, a faded certificate from elementary school that she once sneered at and called useless. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it at the very bottom. Then I closed the lid, turned the tiny key, and heard a soft click. Such a simple sound, yet it made my chest feel lighter. Ethan came over and rested a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. I turned to him and smiled, softly but certain. "Yes. This time, I really am. I didn't burn the letter, and I didn't tear it apart. I wanted it to stay there, as a record. Not to preserve hatred, but to remind myself that once there was a woman who believed love was power. And I, the daughter who had been controlled by that kind of love, had finally learned how to end it." By late afternoon, sunlight broke through the misty rain, casting a soft golden stripe across the wall. I brewed another cup of tea and sat quietly, looking at the wooden box on the shelf. It rested there, small and still, yet holding an entire era that had finally closed. I took a sip, the warmth of ginger spreading down my throat. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside me, the storm had stilled. I would never open that letter again. Not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to understand. Some apologies never come, and I no longer needed them to keep moving forward. That letter would remain in the box, alongside everything that once hurt me, now serving only as proof of one truth: I survived. That night, Seattle's rain fell like threads of silver, steady and endless. Each drop struck the window pane and slid down in long streaks, reflecting the dim streetlights of the city. I sat by the window of our loft, holding a cup of tea gone cold, listening to the wind slip through the cracks and bring with it the chill of late autumn. In the glass, my face blurred into the city's faint glow, a woman looking at herself, no longer angry, no longer afraid, but filled with a quiet peace that words could hardly capture. I once believed that cutting ties with family was the cruelest thing a person could do. My entire childhood had been built on the idea that blood is thicker than water, that no matter how much it hurt, you had to endure, that endurance was the price of being a good daughter. I had obeyed, I had kept silent, I had twisted myself into every shape possible to fit the mold they built for me. But no one ever warned me that endurance, too, could kill a person, slowly, invisibly. I remember the feeling of that last night in the house. The clinking of crystal glasses, the heavy scent of candles, the look in my mother's eyes when she said I was dead to her. Back then, I thought I had truly died. But now, here in this rain-soaked city, I realized I had come back to life. Cutting ties wasn't an ending, it was the birth of someone new, someone who no longer needed permission to exist. They had buried me in contempt, in words sharp enough to draw blood. But from that pain, I learned how to live truthfully. I learned to tell the difference between love and control, between filial duty and surrender. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean reopening the door that once hurt you. And, most of all, I learned that love comes in many forms. Sometimes, it's the courage to walk away. The rain outside fell in steady rhythm, like the slow breathing of the city. I put on my coat and stepped out onto the balcony. The mist hit my face, cold, but real. Below, the lights of the Fremont Bridge shimmered across the water, scattering like 1,000 fragments of memory being washed clean. Ethan joined me, his hand finding mine. His touch was warm, steady, grounding me in the present. We stood there in silence, listening to the rain, as if everything that needed to be said already lived within that stillness. I looked down at the water, at the soft glow dancing on its surface. Those lights looked like memories, never truly gone, but no longer threatening. They stayed there quietly, reminders that I had once been hurt, buried, and yet still rose. I squeezed Ethan's hand and smiled. Maybe, for the first time in my life, I was truly free. No more fear. No more judgment to shrink beneath. Just me, whole, alive, and finally unbound. I thought about my mother. Maybe she was still sitting somewhere in that old house in Aspen, still convinced I was the rebellious daughter, still angry that she couldn't mold me back into what I used to be. But that no longer hurt the way it once did. I didn't wish for her to understand, nor did I need her forgiveness. Some forms of family love can't be repaired, but that doesn't mean I've lost the ability to love. I've simply learned to love differently, starting with myself. I looked up at the silvery gray sky. The clouds gathered, then drifted apart, and for a brief moment, a faint moonlight spilled across the surface of the lake. I heard my own voice echo in my head, calm and steady. I once thought cutting ties was cruel. Now I understand that sometimes, it's the only way to survive. They buried me with their contempt, but from that pain, I learned how to live truthfully. The final image that came to my mind was of Ethan and me walking hand in hand across the Fremont Bridge. The city lights shimmered on the water below, stretching out like endless streaks of light, like scars that had healed, leaving marks but no pain. I turned to look at him. He was smiling, his eyes soft, a quiet confirmation that we had made it through the darkest part. If you're hearing this story, and you too have ever chosen peace over approval, I want you to know you're not alone. Share your story in the comments, because everyone carries a wound, and speaking it out loud is how it stops bleeding. Family ashes will always be a place where those wounds can be told, not for pity, but as a reminder that we survived. And sometimes, surviving itself is the greatest victory a life can offer.